Hi, my name's Benedict. I wanted to show you something that I guess I wanted to simplify it and shorten it up a lot. There are a lot of videos online that are generally really good at showing people how to naturalize, make their strings and orchestral performances sound a lot more realistic when they're working with MIDI. Because the drama that we all have with MIDI is that it's too perfect, and the real world's not perfect. And there are things that we can do, and not a lot of difficulty in doing them either, to actually make things that we do with MIDI sound more real. But it turns out a lot of people don't necessarily realize these things or don't think of these things to come up with them for themselves. So I wanted to attack that. Now, as I said, there are a lot of those videos, but they tend to be long. I want this one to be shorter. Also, there are a lot of people who want to have these MIDI orchestra libraries, Spitfire, East West, these sorts of things, and some of them sound absolutely gorgeous. And I know that top names, Hans Zimmer and what have you, use some of these things and they sound absolutely bloody brilliant, but we can't always afford them. In which case we're left with either using libraries that we feel are very flat or poor quality, or try to find some sort of compromise. The techniques that I show you here will show you that you don't always quite have to feel that you're putting up with stuff. You can make things that should be wrong or unusable far more usable than you think. And that's great technique, because if you then ever do get your hands on the more expensive, the fancier libraries, you're going to do better with them. So let me start. I've made, as you probably can see here, a pretty simple little, what we might call a string quartet section. If we're thinking filmy, then we'll call it a cue, but it's just a little section of something that might be happening. It's not meant to be a full piece. It's not even meant to be a good piece. So if you go judging this based on the piece, please, you're missing the point. I've put together some sounds. Now, for those of you who know Reason, you might recognize straight away that that's Thor. That's a synthesizer. Benedict, why are you not using at least orchestra or something like that? I'm deliberately using synthesizers to show you that you don't actually need string samples to make quite workable string instruments. So we've got just little sort of split staccato, something or other type thing. Little high sound. It is deliberately short. One of the problems we have with MIDI is that we can't tell MIDI what the orchestration is. We can't tell it how that thing is played. So we can't tell it the playing style. We have to tell it bit by bit by bit, which is what we'll work through. The low sound, similar, but it's slower. So one of the first things you can hear here is that high sounds speak quickly, low sounds speak slower. A lot of people don't always think of this. If it's a tiny instrument, everything's small, therefore what happens quickly. Those strings vibrate quickly. But if it's physically a big instrument, which is what we need to create bass, say a double bass, great big bugger, boom, that speaks a lot more slowly because it's physically bigger, it has to move more, therefore everything about it is slower. So if you want something to sound a little bit more realistic, your high-pitched instruments, the ones that are bright and small, will move fast. The sounds will move faster. Your low-pitched instruments will move slowly. Doesn't mean that you can't have fast sounds coming out of them, because I can hear half of you going, but the bass guitar can sound really blib 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 blib. Yeah, you can play the notes fast, but there are still elements of that sound that will move slowly. You might use compressors and what have you to make it sound like it's moving faster. Use a very fast compressor with a slightly slower attack. It'll give you more of a click on the front of a bass sound, but it doesn't mean that the instrument is behaving any differently. You're merely fooling the listener. So, high-pitch instruments, small, move fast. Low-pitch instruments, large, move slowly. Again, moves quickly. So by changing the articulation of that sound, how that sound behaves, we can also change the user's perception of what they're hearing. So once we get this going, somebody who's not paying any attention is going to go, I'm hearing high violins, I'm hearing cellos and double basses, assuming they even think of the names of those instruments. And then in the middle, we're going to have just a set of legato, broad across the bass strings. Let's listen to what we got. So no, I'm not going to pretend that that sounds real, but it's real enough to work in the right situation. It's real enough to sound organic enough. If you're hell-bent on sounding exactly like Hans Zimmer, by all means go out, spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of dollars on buying libraries. That's okay, you're allowed to do that. But in this instance, I'm saying don't feel like you have to spend money on anything. Because if you put in the time and the understanding to think, how do these devices behave? Because a violin is just a device, how do they behave? Then we can improve what we do. If you go even further to think that, how does the person who's controlling this device, how does the guy who's playing the violin behave? Physically, there are restrictions, there are limitations to what he can do. If I had a woodwind line in here, if I wanted to improve its realism, I'd have to think, how does this woodwind player breathe? Because there are a lot of times with MIDI orchestrations where people don't stop to think, am I letting this guy breathe? It's the same with people who'll use drum samples. They'll use all kinds of authentic drum samples, this, that and the other, but they don't stop to think that their drummer has 2 arms and 2 legs. So often you've got 6 or 8 armed drummers. Now either that's multiple takes, which is absolutely fine, but it might be reducing the realism of the performance, or think carefully. There's only so much that a drummer can be doing at any given time. So if he's hitting 3 cymbals at once, how do you do that? So take your time to look at what you're duplicating. How does it behave physically? I'll just quickly show you through the sounds. Mixer I don't care about. Rack, here we go. So some of the beginning of performance is that we've got to understand that an instrument doesn't sound the same every single time. If you're a guitarist, that guitar ding, 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 ding doesn't sound the same every single time, because chances are you're going to be moving your fretting finger somehow. Just add a little bit because you got uncomfortable or you're bored or whatever. It's not going to be in exactly the same position, which means that sometimes you'll be muting or not muting as much. Sometimes your pressure on the actual metal fret is going to be a little different. You get lazy, all kinds of a million reasons why things are a little different. You'll pluck a little harder sometimes, a little less other times. And that's before we even get into the concept of phrasing, because that's something that we will look at as we go. So within the instrument, I could have made that sound so that it has default sustain and then tried to duplicate the articulation of it being a short swipe. But it doesn't actually play out very well. So we're better off to actually say, which matches also with the sample libraries. They don't take one sample and then use ADSRs to say, okay, here's a pizzicato from that. No, they actually get the guys to sit there in the thing and go bleep, 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 and bleep, 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 because they know that that's the only way it's going to sound kind of realistic. So if you're going to do this with a synthesizer, you may well need to make a different patch for each time. There are some times where you might sort of say, no, I'm not going to do it that way, in which case then you're going to use automations. So we might use an automation to change the sustain from that to this. But case by case basis, but that comes from thinking and problem solving. If you think that there's a simple solution, there never is, even if you're using the world's most expensive collection of Spitfire plugins or whatever. You've still got to think your way through it. And that's one of the tricks of a great orchestrator, is that they think their way through how it works. And if you're sitting in Doorland, being the producer and being the performer, you have to think, well, what is my virtual performer doing? Is he pushing? Is he pulling? Is he being lazy? Has he got a second drummer sitting behind him playing that third cymbal? You're allowed to do any of these things, but you've got to think them through if you want them to sound authentic. So, simple sound, but you'll see that I've dialed in a full velocity behavior. So if we get rid of volume, so the brightness, which is the envelope, the filter envelope applying to filter cutoff, is quite variable here. If I got rid of it, sounds great, but means that we've got variety. Now you may need to take a few passes at getting that to balance out inside your piece. If you make one sound and say this is the perfect sound, you're quickly going to find that you've made a mistake, because once you get into your piece, you'll just go, this is the perfect sound, you'll use it solid state the whole way through. So essentially your whole performance will be on, off, on, off, on, off. And that's that flat MIDI sound that you hear in virtual orchestras all the time, because they've gone, oh, these are such lovely sounds, that they just turn them on and off, thinking the sound's going to do the work. Watch an orchestral player, they're doing an awful lot. Watch a guitarist, they're doing an awful lot. And the difference from one guitarist to another, if you have a look at them, is that they're doing an awful lot, but they're doing it marginally differently. And it's not so much in the gear. People spend a lot of time going, oh, I'm going to get the same foot pedal, I'm going to get the same amp cab, I'm going to get the same guitar, and therefore, if I've got all the same things, then I'm Kirk Hammett. Oddly enough, it doesn't work out that way. The reason that Kirk Hammett sounds like Kirk Hammett is because he does things like Kirk does. Kirk probably can't explain how and why he does things like he does. It's just he was born that way. Cats meow, ducks quack, they're born that way. So you're born to play and perform a certain way. Some people do get good at learning to emulate people, and that's a usable skill, probably. But if you're trying to make your music, then work out what did nature set you to do in the way that you perform. And make those out. Don't go thinking you can clone someone, because you'll come off second best. So we've got a lot of versatility and movement there in the brightness of the sound based on the velocity. We also have, we can, and again you're going to want to set that inside your piece. And if you find that an instrument is moving outside of the parameters of how you thought it was going to behave, then either look to do things like I said, you could create an automation lane on some of the parameters, or simply say, okay, I'm going to copy this off and I'm going to make an instrument that better reflects that articulation. Remember, if you buy one of those expensive libraries, orchestral libraries, they will have 6, 8, 10 different articulations. So if we're looking at second violas, then you'll have second violas, legato, spiegato, all kinds of things. I can't remember all the names. Most of them are in Italian or Latin or something or other, but they're all articulations. They're different ways of attacking that instrument, of making it sound different, feel different. So if you get to the point where your instrument's not quite fitting anymore, then either automate parameters in the instrument, which is essentially making a new patch, or copy off and make a new patch that's better suited to that articulation, because that way you're matching a little bit better. It's annoying in this environment to have to say, oh, I've got to create a whole new line, but if you had one violin section, you didn't have 4 like in an orchestra maybe, or a great big orchestra, 3 or 4. If you had one violin section and you wanted to act like you had 4, then you'd record that violin section playing violins 1, you'd then record them again playing violins 2, which is exactly the same thing as us saying, my patch is designed to do this, it's not quite working in that environment anymore, or in that scenario anymore, I'll make another version and change what needs to change so it works there. Again, don't get lazy, because if you think, oh, I'll just use that one all the way through, flat MIDI sound, and you've undone what you're trying to do there. Now again, I'm saying I don't expect this to pass as a real string quartet. It's not really designed to, but what it will do in the right situation is give people the impression that they're hearing a string quartet, and they'll just accept it, they'll enjoy it. Shania Twiddley's Man, I Feel Like a Woman, ba, 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 da, ba, ba, ba. I bet you there wasn't a single horn in the studio there. Do you think that? Nope. Second sound. Actually, I'll cover a little bit of what I've done here. How to make the sounds. This isn't really a patch tutorial thing, because it's violins and I'm assuming there are a few of them. Then I've used multi-oscillators, so each one of these has got some 7 oscillators inside the one little box. A little bit of tuning, not too much. We are not making super saws here. If you try and make your strings sound like super saws from the get-go, it will sound wrong. It may sound great, but it will sound wrong. So we've got that little bit of performance in it. Now in this case, I've actually used this as an equalizer. You can do whatever you want, but the reason I deliberately chose the world's worst equalizer was because it's a unique character-making instrument. A violin is a wooden box, and because it's a wooden box, it creates its own character, its own resonances. It's very easy with the synthesizer. Hear how that's really rather samey as we move. As we move across the range of the instrument, it's rather samey. Now, a finite wooden box with nice little curves and F holes in it is not going to behave that way. Higher notes are going to create resonances one way, lower notes are going to create resonances another way. And there'll be some weird notes in the middle that create little peaks and troughs. So the reason to use a character device, and you can use a resonator, a collection of resonators. Here I decided to try the vocoder as an EQ. Here how we're getting more variety. It's given that sound more character. And one of the things that I've realized as I analyze listening to orchestral libraries is that the instruments have character. Synthesizers and samples and straight samples tend not to have that much character. But there are plenty of ways that we can put it back in, and that's through using things that are essentially creating resonances, anything that creates an unflat line. So if we look at our basic synthesizer patch and see it's a flat line, like assuming we could have a perfect frequency curve. A real instrument doesn't behave that way. It's up and down all over the place. So putting in character effects that create that sense of up and down all over the place help you. I've also got a little bit of reverb. Actually, we'll scoot down here. We'll kill that for the moment. We put in the vocoder, so we're saying to it, I want to highlight the sounds that I want. And again, don't make the rookie mistake of when you solo an instrument making it fully fat, because when you put it in a mix, you just got mush. This sound on its own is a wee bit weedy. That's alright, that's all it needs to be. You listen to one violin on its own. Yuck. So a little bit of extra reverb, you barely notice it. Actually, if we kill off our reverb and echo, I have to remember to turn those on. So it's too dry. Now, some sample libraries are very dry, like Orchestra in Reason here is very, very dry. So when you first load up a sound, you go, ooh, this is really unpleasant. It's like, yuck. But when you load up some of those great big libraries, you know, East-West stuff, Albion or something like that, it sounds gorgeous because you're hearing the rooms that they've recorded in as well. So a synthesizer or a very, very clean set of samples like Orchestra won't have that room in them. So you put it back in. So you can either start to create room reverb around it. Often what I'm looking to do more with these ones is to go really quite short. I'm looking to emulate some of the sound just around that little instrument in itself. Because remember, wooden box is actually vibrating inside. What's vibration inside a wooden box? Reverb in a room. So your violin's box, its body, is actually a little room that's got reverb inside it already. So it just helps add an extra layer of realism in there. The next sound is the low sound, which is not sounding for some reason. There we go. You'll see the same trick exactly. They're essentially the same sound, just articulated differently. Now, this one has that EQ curve, this one has this EQ curve. Do not, even though I initially just duplicated that instrument, copy and paste, do not let them be the same as each other. At this point, when we're creating instruments here, we're looking to create unique instruments. And I know this sounds really stupid and really obvious, but I've seen so many people fall for this, and it's not to say I haven't myself. The violin over here is a violin over here. The cello over here is a cello over here. They are two discrete devices, and notice I'm calling them devices, just as though this was a Mini Moog and this was an Arp Odyssey. They are two discrete devices. We understand they sound different. So if we wanted a Mini Moog sound, we'd probably grab a Mini Moog. So if you're emulating, either through using synthesizers or sample sets that aren't necessarily the highest quality, the loveliest, then make sure that you put the time and effort into making the support things, the things that add the character to that sound, make sure they are different. Because if you say, oh, that worked for that, I'll do it for that as well. No. Yes, I've used similar devices, but I've made sure that the curve and the character that each device pulls out is different. So important that you do that because it helps make your instruments stand out better in the mix. It also gives a greater sense of realism. If everything's very homogeneous, then you're starting to get into square MIDI territory again. Now this guy has a little bit more happening, which we'll get to in a moment. I then put everything into, I'll go back up for this guy, I put everything into a bus. So I've added a bit more reverb. Notice here I'm not even using the best quality reverb I've got access to. That's deliberate. I actually really like the sound of this wee fella. I think that it's got its flaws, but it's got a nice character. Use whatever you want, but don't feel like you have to use the best, especially at the instrument level. Because remember, instruments themselves are rough. They're things of wood and wire. So they are not perfect. They're actually full of imperfections. Grain in wood is an imperfection. Wire is full of imperfections. So using imperfect devices is often a great way to find and develop character. As you're doing that, the character may turn out to be slightly different to what you thought you were going for, but you'll get character, and when you find character, you play that. So here I've added a little bit of reverb. I'm saying, okay, this is the space this section is playing in. It's more of an overt reverb room space. I then used the saturation knob. What saturation does is it just provides tiny, 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 tiny bits of distortion. Essentially extra overtones that shouldn't be there if we were all being perfect. But the last thing we want to be right here is perfect. We want character. So we want to add a little bit of that. If you do use any kind of thing like this, seeing it's a polyphonic performance, as in many notes happening at once, you do not want it to overdrive. Occasionally with solo instruments, particularly woodwind type instruments, that little bit of drive can really push them hard. After all, what is a rock saxophone? Clarence Clemens really wailing on the saxophone is actually creating a lot of distortion in the bell of his instrument. Whole other thing. So a little bit of this, and you'll notice that I'm putting that after the reverb. Initially I had the reverb after because that's the theory, but then I put the saturation after the reverb, and I ended up with a more neatly put together sound and beefier. And then finally a little bit of compression. Now this is prepared to do a bit of work. The compressor is working more than I might in other situations. This is to shape the group. So you don't start doing this stuff, do not start playing with your bus until you've got your performance. Very tempting early on to say, oh, I'm going to compress this sound, or I'm going to bludgeon it so that it sounds uber. But it's solo. We're trying to make something that sounds like it's a group of players. So that's why we're putting them in a bus, and then we're handling their performance in that bus, which means we put them in a room and we've duplicated how that room behaves. Or at least some of the elements of how that room behaves, enough to fool people into thinking that these guys are all in the same room hacking at their little instruments. So remember, your bus last. Get your performance down, getting it sounding good, and then toss each of your instruments into a bus. If you're not quite sure what I mean by bus, that's this fella here, where your mixer, you've got all your mixery channels, each of these instruments, but I've sent it to the bus. Originally, as you're working, let it go here. And then when you've got your performance, send them to the bus and work on your space, your room for that in that bus, which is this here. Please don't do it before. Beforehand, you're going to want to hear some effects. Fine, not a problem, nothing wrong with that. So I had some effects on as I was working, so it gave me a sense of, and that creates some sense of it being in a room. But then when you get your performance, you're going to put that in a bus. So here how is we add those layers of reverbs and what have you, the sound actually gets thicker. Tempting to create the thickest instrument you can at the level where we're working at the instrument. So that's like saying to your single violinist, okay, I'm going to add a stomp box with a whole lot of choruses to you so that you sound fat. It doesn't really work out that way. So get your performance here and then you can build it up. That's your job as a recording, but particularly as the mix engineer. That is your job. And if you're the guy who's doing absolutely everything here, from making the sounds to writing the notes to mixing the notes to the whole production, still separate out. When I'm doing this, this is mix engineer stuff. My producer may have said, hey, let's see what we can do here. Let's see if we can put that string section in a bit of a room and beef it up just a little bit. He says that to his mix engineer. Alright, so a couple of layers of effects, and by layering effects you can put a small amount here, a small amount here, and they will actually compound with each other, which makes for a nice, much fatter sound than just saying I'm going to buy the world's most uber reverb and put it on everything, because you still won't get that great big fat sound that you hear coming out of studios where they've got layers of things happening one after another. But to do that, you'd be more subtle. So we're subtle here, we're a little less subtle here, we're a little less subtle here, but none of these things on their own make the whole picture. Collectively they make the picture. You make it up as you go, and by the time you get to the end you end up with a much nicer, bigger, livelier, engaging sound. So that's our sounds. Hopefully that didn't bore you too much. Mixer I really don't care about because I don't touch this damn thing. Now, instruments, let's play through this again. We'll just pick this fella. You can hear what the line's doing. It's not necessarily a well-written line, that's not the point. But what we're doing there is just the classic sort of, strings do this sort of thing. I'm not good at doing it. I just thought, oh, I'll try. I heard something similar and I thought, I'll try to do that. I'll see what I can get. So it plays. We then add we've got something there, it doesn't belong there, don't know where that came from, so we will pop a solo there because that's where the notes are, forgive me on that. Now very tempting to actually, and I made the same mistake to start with, I just copied these notes to here, dropped them an octave, line done, line not done. Because I'm listening to it going, there's really no sense of definition here. I've got these two instruments and they're not defined. Musically, mix-wise, they're not defined. And then I thought, stupid Benedict, you've assumed one solution for everything is okay. No. So I took essentially this, chopped out some of the notes. So if we're looking at the high line, we're looking at do 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 do. Remember, it's a bigger instrument. You don't want that poor cellist or double bassist to have to hack away at stuff that it's too fast for his instrument and for him to be able to play, because he has to put in more physical effort to play a big instrument than the guy with the little instrument. So think carefully about how that goes. That's part of the job of an orchestrator. Now, I'm not a great orchestrator. I don't know how most of these instruments actually behave. I don't even know where the top and bottom notes that they will play are. So anyone who's a proper orchestrator is going to go, Benedict, you've got your cello playing notes that it can't play. I'm actually not that worried about that myself. if I were working for a proper orchestra, you know, guys with bits of wood and wire and what have you, at that point, no doubt, they would spring for a proper orchestrator for me. So I'd sit down with the guy and I'd have my things written out the way that I like them. He'd come in and go, oh, geez, you bloody untrained rock musicians don't know squat about diddly. But if he knows what he's doing and he's a good guy, he's actually going to help me. He's going to say, oh, no, yep, that note there won't play on that instrument. So we'll work out how to solve it. But until then, personally, I don't care. That's a personal choice, though. I'm not going to say to you, grab a semi-decent orchestral sample set and then start playing it outside of the range of those instruments, because you're probably going to sound stupid. Anyone can pick it, whether they know much about orchestras or not. I just simply say I want my line to go here, and that's where it's going to go. My choice. So you see I've simplified this line to the key things, and then using only the same notes, I wasn't too happy. What we're looking for as we play this bit, it's the bum, ba, ba, bip. It's the top note, that's the whoop. So that's actually a highlight part of that. So it plays high, which actually helps the violin up top sound brighter. Because whilst you've got low notes under the violin, the brain normalizes the two of them. But if the low note suddenly goes high, the whole normalization goes whoop, up. So it helps make that high note really and you'd never know it. So make sure that if you've got big and little instruments, that they're not necessarily playing the same thing or even at the same rate as one another. If one's playing 16ths or 30 seconds, little bastard, then the big guy isn't going to do that. He might play eighths. You'll have a nicer separation of your instruments and a nicer, fuller feel all round. Then we bring in our legato section. Now there's a bit happening in this instrument. I'm going to turn it all off. This is a bit that I want you to really understand. Make sure we got to solo that. Okay. Here's just the notes. The notes are nice enough. I'm not pretending this is a great composition, remember. The notes are nice enough, but the problem that we've got with them is that they sound very static. And this is the sounds like MIDI thing. If you listen to early house music from the 90s, they'd bring in their pads and they're all very sort of static. Here's my pad, here's my next pad, here's my... and it can have a charm. It really can. So I'm not saying don't use it. But if you're sitting there adding strings or anything like that, any kind of orchestration to your piece, be careful that unless you're wanting it to sound static, you need it to move. Some movement you can put in at the patch level. So sometimes things like vibrato you might add in at the patch level. But increasingly I'm adding them in here. I've got my mod wheel set here. So let's add just the vibrato in. Actually, sorry, forgive me a second. I just realised that there's something happening here that I don't want to hear at the moment. Alright, so now we're not going to hear, so we'll just go back and hear. So So again, that's our string with no performance stuff happening to it at all. We've just pressed the notes on, off, on, off. That's where a lot of people stop, thinking, oh, okay, it's a string sound, therefore it sounds like strings. They're hearing in their mind what they want it to sound like, not realizing that it sounds wooden. So we'll add in mod wheel. Mod wheel is set, remember to control vibrato. Forgive me. Notice how straight away this doesn't sound as clean, as simplistic, as flat as it did before, because we've added two layers of movement. One is that there's a pitch vibrato through there. If we looked closely into the actual patch, we would see that that each one of the three instruments within that patch, because there's a string section, so each one of those is set to have vibrato at a different rate. So the two main ones, which are the big ones, they're the ones with multiple oscillators in this case, they're the main vibrato, but I put more vibrato on one of them than I did on the other, which is going to happen because one violinist will do this, the other is going to do this, which means that the LFO amount on one violin is this, and on the other violin is this. So what you can tell the difference between here and here is what we called Detune. So you can build that into your patch. The third sound here in the 3 is actually got a slow LFO that's just gradually moving essentially between those other two sounds. So we're looking to create the movement that many players would have together. This sound isn't fully beefed up to sound like a whole orchestral string section, because I've got a string quartet, so to speak, here. So by adding in that vibrato, and then by controlling it, so that's this here. So this means no vibrato, this means lots of vibrato. And you can hear it there, it comes and goes. So we've now got two layers, just as I built up effects in the mix in two layers, we've now got two layers of movement. Very easy, and I've spent a career doing it, to say, oh, I'll set a nice set of LFOs, and that's my sound. But I learned then that while that can be great, it's very synthy. So if I want to create a lot more movement, all I needed to do was think like an actual player, and you will see a player on a violin will be doing this. So it's hard for me to see how clear this is because my little screen here is lagged. So we emulate that there. We've now got two layers of movement. We'll add a third layer of movement, and this one is the volume control of the device. Now that's relatively subtle. Let's just make this a bit dramatic, a bit overly dramatic. Deliberately overly dramatic, but you're probably realizing, oh my god, that's a sound I commonly hear in productions. This is how they do it. I drew this with a mouse, I will say, and I'll also tell you that that's not really the way you should do it. Get a controller, preferably a slider, nice clear slider, or a foot control. I know plenty of the guys, when they're playing their strings in, as they're composing for film, they're clearly using a foot pedal. If you're a foot pedal kind of a guy, then get a pedal. If you're not a foot pedal kind of a guy, then you can use a mod wheel, or you can use a slider, and do it in real time. It'll take you a couple of goes to start to get the feel, but if you've got the feel for the music that you're writing, then you're going to find that the performance that you deliver really elevates the notes that you've got. Oh, that reminds me, I did set these to a groove channel. That groove channel, quite honestly, is just shaking the notes around. It's having them play randomly out of time, sometimes before, sometimes behind. Just creates that little bit of movement. Don't do it too much or it's going to sound out of time and like the piece is falling to pieces, but a little bit of that's cool. If you're going to get into swing and stuff like that, by all means, but just be cautious, don't overdo it, especially if you're playing orchestral games. So now we've got several layers of movement in our string here. Now I'll add another layer. What this is doing, and I did have it in before, I apologise, is a tremolo. I've flown this in, it's just CV, so control flying into the instrument to control the gain of that instrument. So we're creating tremolo. Now, I know that this doesn't sound like a real string tremolo because they are played differently. I did once make a patch that made a half decent stab at emulating that. Can't remember what I put it, but I do remember that I made it, and I spent probably half a day making this thing that did that. But inside a mix, this will probably do. So as you see, if you follow through the automations, they'll often be similar to one another because we're talking phrasing. So I told you I was going to come to phrasing before. We've got phrases in here. I won't say that I really stopped too much to think about them too much as I was doing it, but we do have some phrasing in here. Let's say, for the sake of ease, that is phrase 1. Sounds reasonable. And this is phrase 2. The ending is a phrase of its own. So you'll see that the automation follows what the notes are doing and the phrasing. So phrasing are like sentences. If you read a book and there were no full stops, no commas, you'd probably put that book down pretty quickly. By putting in commas and full stops, new paragraphs, all of that, we're actually speaking in sections. As I just paused there to give you a few moments to understand that I finished a section. And now I start a new section to talk about this for a little while, let your brain catch up, and then say a little bit more. That's phrases. Music has to have phrases. One of the problems with MIDI is that we can forget phrases and phrasing altogether. If I want to emphasize those, I could even do this and just chop the ends off those. That little tiny gap is actually going to be heard, and it allows the next thing to start again. So do not forget phrasing. Phrasing is a super important thing. Now I know I said to you this was going to be relatively quick. I'm sorry, it's not relatively quick. because the problem is there's too much to get across. If you're not with me anymore, good riddance. If you are with me, then there is hope for you that you are going to be able to learn and get better at this. Sorry if you think that's unkind, but them's is the apples. So we'll get rid of our solos and go back to our whole piece. There we have it. Simplest piece. Again, I'm not saying this sounds like a real orchestra, but it plays the role of a little string quartet, and if that's inside of another piece, people are going to be like, oh, a cute little string quartet happens there. Winning. That's all you got to do. That's all you got to do. So if you have stayed with me through to here, thank you, and again, also thank yourself, because you've taken some time to start to develop understanding as to genuinely how to make your music better. If you've stayed here also, I'll say to you, please don't feel like, if you are not particularly good at something, that A, you have to be good at it overnight, because that's a really dumb idea. When did that happen? Malmsteen wasn't born and 2 minutes later be going, no, it took a lot of time to learn to do it. He may have a better aptitude for it than me, but he still took a lot of time to be able to learn to play as fast as he did. Give it time. Or, there's a reason why Malmsteen is not known as a singer, as a drummer, as a bass player, as a violinist, as a plumber. It's not to say that he isn't passable at any or all of these things. It's just that he's learned to specialize. So you also, if you want to be serious about getting better, should consider specializing. So if you're good at writing the core of a song and playing it on guitar and singing it, that's a lot of specialties already. In which case, I question the wisdom of you becoming a specialist at recording, mixing, I don't like to say the word mastering, but production overall. Is that really wise? I don't think it is, because when you look at the great records, Dark Side of the Moon, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, these are the great records. There was somebody else in the room, a collection of somebody else's in the room. David Bowie didn't play all those instruments. Even his band didn't play all those instruments. They had other guys come in, people who are good at doing a particular thing. So, I know when you think, oh, I've got no budget, but chances are you've got more budget than you think, because a high percentage of the people that I encounter online, they say, I've got no budget for hiring a mixer or a producer or any of that. But they've got plenty of budget to go buy some expensive plugin. They'll spend quite a lot of hundreds of dollars a year on another plugin that they really don't know how to use. They don't know why they've bought it. They don't know how to use it. They spend a lot of time trying to work out how to use it, often never really understanding how and why to use it. Not because they're necessarily stupid, but their stupidity is in that they have invested in something that's not a great idea for them. Invest in what's a great idea for you. Find out what your core talents and abilities are. Invest in those. If you have a DAW, if you have a software environment, then it's already come with everything you need. It really has. If anybody says to you, oh, well, you need a better this, that, and the other before you can start to sound pro, punch that fucker in the nose and say, fuck off, you little twit. Get the hell out of my life. Because they're going to see you spending a lot of time doing something you're not good at, which is the equivalent of hiring Malmsteen into your band and saying, yeah, go play drums. Does that sound insane, having one of the world's fastest electric guitarists playing drums? It does. So why are you doing things that you are not best suited for? Save the money that you would waste on plugins and various other bits and pieces of software or gear that you think is going to somehow make you pro. Find quality people to work with, not people who go on about, nigga, my beats are more beaty than your beats, I'm more pro because I've got, bypass those people. Again, just punch them in the nose and say, get the fuck out of my way, you little prick. Because these people are just not doing anything useful. Find the people who clearly are good at doing the things that you're not so good at. Like when you YouTube Malmsteen, because you weren't quite sure who the hell I was talking about, Yngwie Malmsteen with a Y on the front. You'll see that in any of his shows, he's out front playing guitar, somebody's got a mic and is singing, somebody's playing the drums. A, because he can't do all these things at once, but he came up through the 80s, so he realistically could have done all these things. Somebody as impressive as Malmsteen probably could have gone on stage like Depeche Mode with a reel-to-reel tape recorder behind him and gotten away with it. But he didn't. So specialize in what you're good at. Find people who specialize in what they're good at. And the other tip that I'm going to give you in the middle of this, if you've stayed with me, is that when you're looking at specialists for what they're good at, look at what they're really good at. Don't be the dill who says, oh, but I only make grunge blip hop, therefore I can only work with a producer who makes grunge blip hop. Yeah, I'm paying out on you. I'm paying out on you because I've seen many people make that mistake. The great producers, go out there, watch some of them on YouTube. Watch them talking about how they work. Don't watch the videos where they're there presenting their Waves plugin or whatever. They're just making money off you. Watch the ones where they talk about their craft. They're longer videos, and they're not going to say to you, turn the knob on the left to 48 degrees and you'll be a hit, because they know better than that. They're talking about their craft, the mindset, how things flow, how they work. You'll see that they're really not talking about genre ever. And often they acknowledge that they don't use a lot of the tricks that everybody rabbits on it about in forums. Oh, I side changed my mix bus to my energy bus and They don't talk like that. They often actually acknowledge that they don't even really do those things. So if you're going to hire in somebody, rather than wasting your money on plugins you don't know how to use, don't look for somebody who is able to show all the wibbly talk of your genre. Look for somebody who can do quality work. If somebody can do quality work mixing, let's say, an orchestra. Let's say they do quality work mixing classical music, the real hardcore stuff, Beethoven, Mozart. If they're good at mixing that, while mixing your blip hop may not be the first thing that they think of, once they can understand what your blip hop is supposed to sound like, they can mix it. And they're going to learn pretty fast because they've got a great background. The guy who can only mix blip hop can't mix anything but blip hop, and often can only mix his own hop, because he actually isn't a mix engineer at all. So look for somebody who's really broad, somebody who speaks like a professional. So watch a couple of those videos with real professionals talking about their craft. Not tips and tricks, not showing you my latest plugins, but where they're talking about their craft. Learn what that feels like in that kind of person. And then you're going to find that you get a very similar feeling whether they're somebody who works with rappers or classical orchestras. There's a commonality in that mindset. That's the mindset you want to hire. Now, yes, those people that you're looking at are probably inaccessible to you. Andrew Sheps doesn't seem to have any visible way of being in contact with. And this doesn't mean that he wouldn't work for you, but he's probably too expensive for either of us to work with, or even all of us put together. But look for people who are accessible. They're there. They may or may not have a little sign out front saying, I will do this. But if you see that they are quality, not just sort of one step above you, but if you look and you go, you know, this person really does deliver great results, try approaching them. And when you approach them, make sure you make an offer, because you need to get their attention. If you approach them and say, oh, you know, yeah, or I'm sorry, but they're not going to help you because you haven't helped yourself. So land in front of them and say, hey, I do this stuff. I have seen that you do some really stellar work. I'm delighted with what I hear that you do. Yeah, my blip hop may be a little different to your thing, but I'm hoping maybe you can do some of this work for me. And tell them what your budget is. If you know that you were going to buy Ozone twice this year, you've got a budget of $300 or whatever the hell Ozone costs. But easily, if you're buying 2 decent sized plugins this year, you're spending $300 a year on plugins. That's before we even count the $29 ones that you probably fall for 2 or 3 times as well. So at least $300 you've probably got to put towards this guy. So say, hey, look, I don't have a big budget, but if we could find a way maybe to make it $300. If you do this right, and you don't be a dick about it, don't go creating arguments, you may well find that suddenly you're able to work with people and that you end up with a better sounding record than you ever would have on your own. So you came to me to look at how to make your synth sound less MIDI and more like a real orchestra. I've given you the where to put the knobs, what to do it. I've given you all the thinking. Hopefully you haven't ignored that, because that's the bit that's where the money is. But I've also given you a third piece of advice, which is actually don't do it. Write the notes, or your section of the notes that you're good at, then hire it out to somebody who knows how to do it better than you ever will, so that you get an even greater result. Because when people are listening to your record, they're going to go, my God, that string section's really just lovely. That's if they're another musician. If they're not, they're just a fan, just a punter, and they're the ones you want to have buying your records. They're just going to go, that's a great song, and you know, it really lifts at that point. Thank you.